In this lecture, we are venturing the furthest east that we will in the course to consider another river-based civilization, but one very different from that of the Sumerians. The Indus Valley Civilization, as the name pretty clearly states, developed in the Indus Valley in what is now India and Pakistan. Every time I think about the Indus Valley Civilization, I remember that line in Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indiana Jones says, "It represents everything we got into archaeology for." In this case, that means not the Lost Grail or anything, but a lost civilization with mysterious origins and an equally mysterious end, an undeciphered script and an unknown language, and great cities that are not fully excavated or understood, and evidence of a complex culture unlike any found elsewhere in the world. Doesn't get any better than that. However, if you have a low tolerance for ambiguity, the Indus Valley Civilization is bound to lead to frustration. The greatest vestiges of these people were in the two great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. The culture is sometimes known as Harappan from the name of the first of these cities. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were occupied for thousands of years, but their major developments occurred in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, about 2500 BC. Harappa is about 350 miles or 560 kilometers north of Mohenjo-daro on the banks of the long dry river Ravi, while the larger and better preserved Mohenjo-daro, which we'll look at, was built on the banks of the Indus River itself in modern-day Pakistan. Now this leads us to, I think, the first problem in studying this civilization, and that's modern-day politics. Modern-day politics is frankly always difficult in archaeology, and in this case it's particularly difficult because the Indus Valley Civilization really straddles the border between India and Pakistan. And so some archaeologists, those in Pakistan, would like to see it as, the foundational civilization of Pakistan. Those in India would like to see it as the foundational civilization of India. And so even the wording, that is, what you call the civilization, has political significance. Those who refer to it as the Indus Valley Civilization are, they're in danger of being called Indian nationalists. And those who call it Harappan generally are trying to neutralize the political ramifications. So it's very difficult in terms of the modern politics, which projects itself back in terms of who these people were or what they gave to the world. So I think that's important to keep in mind. It changes what we think about the civilization and even what we call it. Well, unlike the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, the lack of comprehensible written evidence here means that for the Indus Valley, we're almost totally reliant on the archaeology to understand the culture and its cities. There's no Epic of Gilgamesh for this city. In fact, notably, the rulers of these Harappan cities are invisible to us in both city remains and in their art. And this is pretty extraordinary. In addition, there is no imagery of or evidence of warfare. The lack of ruler or war art and also an undeciphered script finds parallels in the later Minoan civilization on Crete, which we'll examine in an upcoming lecture. But the complete lack of evidence for social stratification is unique here and among all ancient cities. And it forces us to question if we have here a completely different form of social control than we find in the Near East, in Mesopotamia, or in ancient Egypt. Unfortunately, this question of social control and social stratification is one we cannot yet fully answer. Now, along with Harappa, Mohenjo-daro seems to have been one of the 5 main cities of the people of the Indus Valley. These 5 cities seem equally spread up the river valley and may all be regional centers, which is interesting because it means, as we believe, none of them had supremacy over any of the others. Another intriguing clue to their seemingly flat social structure. We don't have a hierarchy. This isn't an empire. In its greatest phase of development, with a population of about 30,000, Mohenjo-daro is contemporary with the Sumerian cities of Uruk and Ur at the height of their power, but not as big. Uruk at its height had, well, at least 50,000, perhaps 80,000 people. So Mohenjo-daro a little smaller, but contemporary. Mohenjo-daro was laid out on the high ground at the banks of the river, making use of the topography. We don't know why. For defense, perhaps, or just to avoid the flooding that swept the valley regularly. We saw this earlier at Jericho, where avoiding the flash floods was the reason for settling that particular spot. The city here seems to have had originally had a nearly square plan, divided into 12 roughly rectangular blocks by main streets that run north-south and east-west. That orientation is of some note because at the same time in the Bronze Age we see Egyptian cities, temples, palaces, and tombs laid out the same way, facing north for religious reasons. So we think perhaps, just perhaps, this may have a religious connotation. The blocks themselves measured about 370 meters by 250 meters. And were divided by main streets about 10 meters wide and side streets between 1.5 and 3 meters wide. The central block on the west side of the city, on the western edge in the center, was occupied by a raised, fortified citadel, measuring approximately 1,200 by 1,600 feet, or 365 by 185 meters. This central block, arguably the public district of the city, and it is arguable, and people argue about it today, there will be arguments, has a comparable area at Harappa. So both of these cities have the same sort of layout, or at least the same sort of design. This citadel, if we can call it that, was on about a 20-foot or 6-meter high brick podium. It contained 3 buildings that are of particular importance: a large granary, a bath that's presumed to be ritual, and a large public gathering building, we believe. Some other buildings may have had public functions, but there's no recognizable palace, no temple, and no civic buildings. That is, no buildings that give us any sense of what the form of government was like, or what their religion was like, or who ruled them. Given this set of public buildings, it's difficult to draw conclusions about the civic organization or social structure of the city, and therefore the wider Indus Valley civilization. We also lack completely, while I'm giving you the bad news, I'll give it all to you, we lack any royal tombs of the kind found in the Nile and Mesopotamian regions. From this same period at Ur, we have what's called the Great Death Pit and great royal tombs. And of course, in Egypt, we have a huge number of royal tombs. Those, of course, are important for giving a sense of kingship in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Here, there's nothing like that. The majority of the city was, as you might expect, taken up with houses, its residential areas. These houses were mostly 2 stories tall and built rectangularly surrounding internal courtyards. This is a form of house that's recognizable for many cities across the Near East or Southwest Asia and across really the Mediterranean basin. It's tempting. Oh, it's really tempting. It's a temptation that sometimes we don't resist to draw parallels from these other later cultures and to analyze the houses here, as we would later ones, as economic units, not just as family units. But there is simply no evidence to support such a contention. How the houses were used, and even if they represent the center for only a single family or kinship group, is completely unknown. Social distinction, if not social structure, is indicated by the houses. That, by which I mean, most of the houses are composed of a handful of rooms surrounding a courtyard, but some, very few, are large structures of several courtyards surrounded by clusters of, well, several dozen rooms. Those may indicate social structure in that they may be the houses of extended families. They may tell us that people are living together in large family groups. Or, again, sorry about the ambiguity, they may in fact be the houses of the elites here. But the rooms and the organizations suggest the former. They suggest that these are compounds, family compounds, not palaces or elite dwellings. All of the construction here in the Indus Valley, the fortification walls, the public buildings, the infrastructure, and the private houses relied on brick. It must have presented, I think, a remarkably homogeneous image, as though the entire city were carved out of clay. If you ever get to go to Dubrovnik in Croatia, or even see pictures of it, the entire city is made of the same limestone. Every wall, every surface, sidewalk, street, gutters, it's all carved out of the same white limestone. And it gives this remarkable integration of image to the entire city. I think that's what we have here at Mohenjo-daro. There's no evidence of wall painting surviving, and it's thought that none of the walls of houses or public buildings were painted at all, in, frankly, shocking contrast to every other city that we know of that had wall decoration. No evidence here. One thing that's particularly significant about the construction here is that the mud bricks used to construct the city were fired, not just sun-dried. This is important in an area with monsoons and floods, as you probably could figure out. But it's also remarkable at this period, again about 2500 BC. As we saw with the walls of Uruk, firing millions of bricks takes tremendous organizational capabilities, arguing here also for central organization and complex society with a well-developed social structure and division of labor. It also takes huge amounts of resources, both labor and raw materials. There's a reason we don't find large numbers of fired brick structures in Mesopotamia or Egypt, and why the walls of Uruk are so special. Although those cultures have the necessary division of labor and central organization, they simply don't have the wood to burn in kilns to fire the brick. The Indus Valley does. In any case, the complex effort involved in firing bricks seems to argue for a centrally controlled society. But, as previously noted, when we talked about the houses in particular, one without recognizable social structure or rulers. I really think someone needs to get busy figuring this out. How could you have an organized society without a structure to it? It seems as though everybody's on the same level. It's really it's unprecedented. As a really tantalizing bit of evidence for the extent of central control here in Mohenjo-daro, I point out that the bricks were made in a ratio of thickness to width to length of 1 to 2 to 4. That same ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 is found throughout the city in the proportions of rooms and entire buildings, public and residential. We don't just seem to have central control, we seem to have central planning. The entire thing is an integrated plan where all of the parts seem to be in some kind of regular proportion with one another. An extraordinary idea for a society, as I say, which doesn't seem to have any social structure to it. Well, let's take a look now at some of these buildings. As a start, let's discuss the building remains on the so-called citadel of Mohenjo-daro, which archaeologists agree is the city center. On the citadel platform was what is, I think, the most important of all these buildings, the Great Bath. It's a basin about 39 feet by 23 feet and 8 feet deep, about 12 by 7 by 2.5 meters. It is the main feature of the earliest known public water system in the ancient world. It's entered by 2 wide staircases. So picture an enormous bath set into the ground, and then 2 staircases that lead down into it, constructed of very carefully laid brick with gypsum plaster to make it watertight. It had a surrounding portico, a roofed porch, that is, supported on one side by columns and the other side by a wall, surrounding all 4 sides. So we have an open-air bath surrounded by a walled portico around it. Behind the portico on the east side was a set of 27 individual rooms, often compared by the excavators or those who study the society to monastic cells, but whose purpose is unclear. That is, we don't know if they're actually residential. We don't know anything. Sorry. Another set of larger rooms was found behind the portico on the north side as well. These have also been compared to monastic cells, but they may have served another religious function as contemplative retreats for prayer or meditation. In other words, rather than cells where somebody is living all the time surrounding the bath, these may be places where people would come on pilgrimage. They would bathe and they would go into one of these individual little cells or units to retreat. And they would pray, meditate, and then come out, but not stay here. It may be a place where people pass through. Or, again with the ambiguity, they may have been therapeutic. And their use, therefore, connected to the bath, which may possibly have had a non-religious function. If we think about parallels for that, we could think about the Roman bath complex at Baiae, the great resort complex, which has enormous open baths, open to the air, surrounded by porticos, and behind the porticos are individual little rooms. These were therapeutic at Baiae. People would sit in those rooms and relax or see a doctor or take the waters or whatever. They were for pleasure and for therapy. Here, however, the normal argument is that the bath is religious. In fact, behind these rooms in the portico was another complex that archaeologists sometimes refer to as the college. See, one excavator postulated that its rooms, the rooms of the college, were for a college of priests. And that is, pilgrims or people coming to take the waters, to bathe, would be in the rooms surrounding the bath, and then the next line back would be the college of priests in a more exclusive position. This is a neat idea, but there is simply no evidence in support of it. And so this interpretation, as well as all others, is purely speculative. So really the use of these rooms remains a complete mystery. Almost all scholars agree, and that's really the best you can always hope for, that the Great Bath here at Mohenjo-daro was designed not for hygiene or recreation or therapeutic bathing, as were Roman baths. Instead, it's thought to have been primarily designed for ritual purifications, of the type, frankly, well known from many ancient religions. Examples of this abound. In the Jewish religion, the mikvah was used as a ritual bath. I'm thinking of the sanctuary of Venus at the Greek city of Paestum in southern Italy, which had a large ritual bath with a tremendous staircase on one side so that entire processions of worshippers of Venus could process into the bath together. And of course, the Ganges River today is still a ritual bathing site for millions of people. And, Christian baptism, I think, provides us another possible parallel. So you can see there's a lot of possible options. Well, to the south of the Great Bath is a large pillared assembly hall, and that name Assembly Hall was given by the excavators. The use of it, we have no idea. We don't know who is in here or who assembled here. But this is an enormous columned hall which measured about 92 feet or 28 meters square. The name given by the excavators, Assembly Hall, suggests a civic function. The interior was divided by 3 rows of 5 brick bases for the 15 wooden columns that originally supported the timber roof. The floor was laid with fired brick. The excavators here drew parallels to other large columned halls from antiquity, I should say from later in antiquity, such as the Egyptian hypostyle halls that are found in their great temples, the Persian square audience hall in the Apadama Palace at Persepolis, or to the Roman Basilica, the civic hall, a large columned hall that housed its law courts. The purpose of the Assembly Hall here, however, is a complete mystery. And I feel like I need to point out one distinction between this Assembly Hall and all those other possible parallels. And that is that this one has no provision for a ruler. All of those other assembly halls have a space which is architecturally distinct where the ruler sits. They're audience halls. And so they have a niche on the middle of one side for a throne and a place for a ruler. Here at Mohenjo-daro, there's no such thing. It's just a big open hall. And so making that parallel to audience halls may be a little much. Certainly an assembly building of some kind. It's made for large numbers of people. But who and why and how, we just don't know. The final building on the citadel was called by the excavator the granary. This one I think they got right. The granary was a particularly sophisticated building. It's arranged in 3 rows of 10 separate grain storage rooms with air passages built in. And you need air passages to flow through grain storage facilities because grain needs to stay dry. If it gets wet or stays wet, it can rot. And when it rots, it actually bursts into flames. You need to keep air circulating so dust doesn't build up because it's combustible. Grain's really a lot of work. And so this building, I think, the design of it makes it very clear that it's a granary. This idea of air passages built into a brick granary is a refinement that we only find next 2,800 years later, and only in the most architecturally complex of Roman brick granaries. The granary here at Mohenjo-daro originally measured about 150 feet by 75 feet, or 46 by 23 meters. So it's a huge building. Again, giving us implicit evidence of central planning, that this is the community's granary. It was a wooden building above the level of the foundations. And, as I'm sure you saw coming, saying that it was called a granary by the excavator in 1950 reveals that other people don't think so. That there have been debates about what this building was used for. And there's no point in going through all the alternate identifications because there's no evidence for any of them. Not that there's good evidence that it isn't a granary, but no one has a plausible alternative. But I should point out that doubts have been raised. The remaining fortifications of the citadel include a surviving segment of rampart wall about 45 feet, that's about 14 meters wide at its base, with an angled fired brick exterior and an elaborate gateway. And you want to have that angled exterior because it keeps people from using battering rams. If you have a flat surface and you hit it with a battering ram, it can collapse. That angle makes it glance off. So this is a sophisticated system. Most remarkably, throughout the entire city, there are elaborate drainage and water systems, not just in public areas. We have wells, bathrooms, literally rooms for bathing, and drains that can be seen in virtually every one of the houses. Common as well are the main drains in the streets, with stone manhole covers for inspecting, maintaining, and cleaning the underground passages. A system of such size and sophistication that is not seen again until the city of Rome in the 1st century BC, roughly 2,500 years later. The entire city seems to have been designed with water systems in mind, from the Great Bath all the way down to the common houses. We see an emphasis on the distribution and control of water. It's hard not to view this as a religious element in society and not just one of practicality and hygiene. Certainly, recognizable bathrooms and latrines are found throughout the buildings, but the focus on bathing seems consistent with later cultures with an emphasis on ritual purification. One of the most intriguing finds in the city is a small steatite or soapstone statuette. By small, I mean it's about 7 inches or about 17.5 centimeters tall. It's known as the Priest King. Yes, we don't know exactly if they had priests and we don't know if they had kings, but we call it the Priest King because that's the conventional name for a Bronze Age ruler who combined religious and civic functions. This figure shows a seated, bearded man wearing a circlet or a diadem on his head, so king-like, with only a circular ornament over his forehead and, interestingly, an identical band with a simple circular ornament on his upper right arm as well. His only garment is a cloak thrown over his left shoulder. The cloak is decorated with a pattern of circles and trefoils. That is an abstract image of a three-leafed plant. We think that the pattern here may actually preserve a weaving pattern used by the Harappan rulers, if they were rulers. The figure is the only image of what we think was the combined civic and religious authority of the Indus Valley Civilization's people. You might ask, why is it a priest king? Why is it not, in fact, a god? Well, evidence that the so-called priest king is not a deity or the deity of these people comes from one of the 2,000 carved steatite seals found in the city. On the rectangular field of this seal are 2 rows of figures. The bottom row is a line of 7 figures who are going forward in a procession. The top row shows a female figure who's clearly higher status because of hierarchy of scale, that is, she's bigger than anyone else, and because of upper position. Placing her at the top is a standard visual cue for upper status. So she's larger and above all of those down below in the procession. We identify her as a deity, a goddess. She wears a horned headdress. She stands beside a fig tree with a worshiper kneeling in front of her. Great iconography for worship. A large ram fills out the upper register next to her, which I think indicates a sacrifice. As with most of the carved seals, again about 2,000 of them, it contains some of the signs of the undeciphered Indus script. Now, writing, as we saw at Uruk and we'll see later in Egypt, at Mycenae and Tiryns in Greece, is an urban phenomenon. It developed in cities for the detailed record-keeping necessary to ensure that people could live together in large groups. Originally, food supplies and religious rituals were recorded, followed by civic and legal matters. And finally, and lastly, we think, literature. Large areas of the city here, which seem to be common areas and therefore perhaps public space, are given over to the storage and processing of commodities. This again suggests a centralized economy, probably controlled by an authority who held both civic and religious power. One of the most interesting of these is an area found in a number of the Harappan cities that was designed for industrial-scale fabric dyeing. Remains of cotton fabric were found here, perhaps the earliest evidence of the cultivation of this important plant. Based on the remains of their work, other areas seem to have been workshops for potters, bead makers, metal workers, and workers in steatite, shell, and faience. Faience is that glassy fired quartz material used to cover ceramics that makes them look like glass or metal. The Harappan civilization had a very well-developed division of labor that allowed specialists to concentrate on particular skills and crafts. Interestingly, again, no evidence of social structure, but division of labor. The inhabitants of the Indus Valley cities lived in communities that were very different from what we're used to today. And what we conclude were structures of collective labor and combined religious and civil authority. And that comes from the priest king. Their cities reveal none of the architectural forms associated with kingship or religious observance in civilizations further west, leading to considerations that they had a unique social and political structure. And yet, they lived in houses that would become the pattern for Southwest Asia for the next 2,000 years. 2-story mud brick houses with balconies, courtyards, and flat roofs for additional living or storage space. And they lived in a community with better food security, water resources, and hygiene than any other city for the next 2,000 years. Why then did Mohenjo-daro cease to exist? Well, we know it wasn't invasion, disease, or similar catastrophe. Like its sister city at Harappa, it relied for its survival on its proximity to the river. And when the Indus River shifted its banks, the city was eventually abandoned, leaving it much as we see it today, preserving the lives of people who lived there, well, over 4,500 years ago. But its culture may not have vanished without a trace. Many of the leading scholars of this culture think that the descendants of the Indus Valley civilization were instrumental in the development of the Vedic culture in India, the forerunners of modern Indian culture. Clearly, there's a pattern of river-based cities in antiquity, as we saw at Uruk in Mesopotamia and here in the Indus Valley. The longest lasting of these civilizations, however, was along the Nile in Egypt. There, in the next set of lectures, we'll examine an urban civilization with superficial similarities to those we've seen so far, but with very different approaches in its social structure and in creating a ruler-centered urban landscape.